Up to you guys to enlighten us. Woo.
All right. So to give background on this talk, so this is sort of my collecting journey, just the experience I went through, and all of you have probably had different collecting journeys. There's no like one way to collect. But one of the topics I'm very fascinated with is how as collectors we can pass on what we have learned. I think as a collecting community, we sometimes make it difficult for people to learn about, and I think there's a ton of skills and experience that really help other collectors along. And so years ago, I put this together to try to, tell some stories of cool things I picked up, but also how to really encourage people to think out of the box. And so that's what sort of this is about. And I'll start off, just saying like rules of collecting. And the first rule is there are no rules. Anyone who tries to gatekeep and tell you this is collecting and this is not collecting, they're lying to you. So, I firmly believe there are no rules to collecting. In fact, throughout my collecting career, I can point to so many examples of where people said, oh, you can't do this, you can't do that, and I am not very good at following orders, and so I didn't do it, and it served me well. And I think I encourage people to do that all the time. But you can also learn from what people have done in the past, right? And so, but I think there's also a ton of myths in collecting. I think there's this myth that like you need a lot of money and a time machine and had to have been in the right place at the right time to be a successful collector, and I think that's just also nonsense. I think at any time people can get into collecting. Obviously, some people who started earlier have some advantages, but with that said, I think there are a lot of skills that are involved in collecting. I think often collectors talk about knowledge. That's an important thing. The more you know, the more you're equipped to deal with collecting. But there are a lot of other things too. And I'll get into this in the talk. Knowing when to strike, like when is it time to splurge, and knowing how to budget, and building a network, and researching, and there's all these things that go into collecting. And so I'll share with you some successes and failures I've had in doing that. So to start off, when I was a kid, starting at around age 8, I was collecting various other things like baseball cards, coins, and I also really was into toys. And and one of the things, if you look at these examples, most of these are things that were actually before my time. So even at an early age, I was collecting baseball cards from not even a time when I was following baseballs, from like 20 years in some cases before than the current ball players. Or coins, I just was really interested in older coins, not contemporary coins at the time in the 70s, but things like Mercury dimes, which finished in, I think, in the 60s. And then pieces of 8. I had, my family came from Cuba, and my father told me a story about how he had all these coins in Cuba, but because when you leave there, you lose all your possessions. So he basically left this coin collection he had with my great grandfather, and so we figured out a way. I said, "Wow, that's interesting. Can we get it?" And so they figured a way to smuggle it out of Cuba in the 70s, and it had like pieces of 8, all these like incredibly rare coins. And so I was like, I think maybe 9 years old. I go into a coin dealer and say, "Hey, you tell me what this stuff is." And the guy's like, looking at this little kid holding these like coins from the 1700s, and he's like, "Where'd you get these?" But I had really expensive taste, unfortunately or fortunately, at an early age. So I was having my parents drive me to like baseball card shows, when I was like 9 or 10 years old, and I was, going after things that were just no kid was collecting, because I always, looked at it like, what do I want? I start from what I want, not what's accessible, but what do I want, even if it seems impossible, and then just sort of go for that. And I was already doing that at an early age. So I was already collecting as a kid. I mean, not in the serious way as an adult, like the way we collect. But then summer of 1977 happened, and everything changed for me. And I'm sure for some of you, it was a similar thing. I wasn't even into science fiction. I think the genre of film that Star Wars, represents was not my thing. But it was such a moment, and I think this is something lost on people who weren't around at the time, what life was like before and after Star Wars, because it changed everything. I mean, if you think about it, almost every major blockbuster film since 1977 in some way has emulated Star Wars. and it changed movie merchandising. It had this profound impact, and it did on me as a kid. I overnight just became a big Star Wars fan that summer of 1977. Saw the film a whole bunch of times, and I was totally into it. So if you combine this sort of earlier interest in collecting, it was natural, even as a kid, that collecting was going to be a thing that I was going to be into. But that first year, there wasn't a whole lot around. Really, it was printed stuff because they didn't have time to have things manufactured and shipped, from China or and other places where they were manufacturing things. So most of the products out that first year were the things that could get printed, and also for the licensees that had the foresight to strike deals, and also the role that Charlie Lippincott played in selling these to different licensees. And so my first things were the trading cards. They were the blue card set that was available in the U.S. that summer of '77. And again, my past interest in baseball cards made that one a natural. And so that was something I was really into early on. And of course, toys weren't available that year in '77. They weren't widely available other than some printed toys. There weren't any action figures, and I bought the early bird certificate, like maybe some of you did or did not. But that I was closely anticipating those action figures to come out in the spring. So I remember buying my early bird set, and I had collected action figures before. I had Mego action figures, Evel Knievel action figures. So I loved action figures already. So Star Wars was just a natural for that. But yeah, that was that even that first year I remember the first day, because we had a local toy store and I would check it almost every day, and then I knew the early bird was coming out. Once they got it, I bought it, and they had like pictures of what they were going to look like. So I was eagerly anticipating. I would check the mail every day and see, has it arrived yet? Have the figures arrived yet? And my action figures arrived after, actually the 12-back started to appear like a week before my figures arrived, which was kind of annoying. But anyway, that's what started it with action figures for me. But there were a lot of other collectibles, but there was a time in the 70s, late 70s, when it was actually possible to be a completist. There are obviously people that endeavor to be completists today, and like Duncan and Steve have done an amazing job, completing everything. But at some point it just becomes insurmountable. But in the late '70s, it was actually plausible to be a completist, at least for items in your own country. So it was like comics, fan club stuff, puzzles, food. There were food items, and I was pretty much going after everything that was available then. And then I continued through. I'd say about 1986, I stayed a member of the fan club. I continued getting Marvel comics. I was pretty plugged in with Star Wars, but there was, when they just sort of abruptly cut everything off, and there was that, the dark times of, about 1986 to about 1990, where there wasn't a whole lot coming out, so I wasn't actively collecting. I was still, into the fandom of Star Wars, but there wasn't a whole lot going on. And so I wouldn't consider myself a collector. I wasn't collecting then. But I did get back into it in the early 90s, like circa 90, 91, I was, they started to come out with, we had the Zahn novels, we had Dark Empire came out by Dark Horse. Steve Sansweet's phenomenal book, Concept of Screen, a Collectible, was inspirational. You had magazines that were covering things like the Tilmart Action Figure Digest. So I was acquiring those even before I wasn't even really collecting yet. So it was like circa 1990, 91, 92. I was buying books and comics. I was reading about action figure collecting, but I wasn't really active. I was on news groups, which was the way people connected at the time on Usenet before we had Facebook, before we had social media of today. That was the way we connected online, and I was poised to collect. But the thing that was sort of holding me back was that I didn't have my original action figure set. I knew I was living in Seattle. I had moved out to Seattle for grad school, and my parents lived in New Jersey. And all the stuff from childhood I had saved in New Jersey, but I could never find it on trips to visit them. I would search the house. I know we saved them. I know they are here. But there was this room in the basement where my father kept a whole bunch of stuff. So my father was a pack rat. He saved like everything. None of that really brushed off on us, but but anyway, he saved everything that he had. And so there was this one room that he locked up with all the stuff he saved. And one day I just defied him, so I'm going to go in there. Again, this is breaking the rules. I'm going to go in and check this room because he would not let me go in it. And of course, all my Star Wars stuff was in this room. I had the foresight to put it in that room because I knew no one would touch it. So then once I had all my Star Wars items with me, I took them back to Seattle, and I told Pam, who's my wife now, was my girlfriend at the time. I said, yeah, I have my original action figure set. I'm just going to now get the few I didn't get, and then I'll be done collecting. And of course, she reminds me of this story all the time. Yeah, you were going to be done when you finish your loose action figure set. So, but what I did was I posted. This is the message I posted April 1st, 1993, in the news groups. So I finally had my action figure set, and now it's the time to really embark on collecting. And what's interesting, I dug up this quote. What was interesting about it when I look back at it, some of it you look at it, oh, it's kind of naive, but in many ways, I felt like, wow, I asked the right questions, right? I assume there must be communities where people collect. There must be places to buy and sell. How can I connect with them? And as people, like when you're beginning collectors, I think oftentimes some beginners ask fairly open-ended questions, but I tried to like connect me with other people, and how do I find this stuff? And then that opened up a whole world for me. People gave a lot of advice, and then from there, could bootstrap it. But one of the first things I did was advertise in local newspapers. So for me, I lived in Seattle, so I advertised in the Seattle Times. And I would post these ads, and it were fun times because it was like all these vintage collections, and you hear these stories that people talk about. I had this great Star Wars collection, and then I went off to college, and then my parents sold off my Star Wars stuff. Well, I was the guy buying up all those Star Wars collections when I went off to college. So I was buying these collections, but what really opened my eyes in collecting there was. A lot of kids collected other things, and so we had these things we grew up with that we're nostalgic for that we had as a kid, but it exposed me to the really wide range of Star Wars memorabilia that was out there, and so as in the process it'd be like ceramics or non-post mass or micro collection, things like that I didn't have as a kid, but I was like, oh, that's a cool thing, so I'm going to start collecting that. And then what I would do is in buying these collections, I'd buy a big collection, I'd keep a few things, and then I would sell the excess. And this is how, as a student on a shoestring budget, I was able to grow my collection, which is sort of one of the things I try to tell people is, budget, yes, if we all had like infinite money, it'd be great. In some ways, I actually think that, in my opinion, more money early on is actually not a good thing in collecting, because I think that understanding how to prioritize is a very important thing. Everyone has a budget, and as a student, I figured out a way to shoestring this and bootstrap my collection through selling stuff and keeping things along the way. So yeah, this is something I encourage people to do, is like figure out how can I, and some of you have done the same thing, like buy up in bulk so that you can then sell individual pieces. So yeah, it sort of gets to my points on money and collecting comes up often, which is that everyone has a budget. Even people that drop big money in high profile auctions, they even have budgets too. They might have more to spend. But in many ways, like having unlimited funds can actually, I've seen cases of people where they come into the hobby, they're already fairly wealthy, and they haven't learned like most of us have learned of like how what's the right splurge, what's the time to be cheap, what's the thing I'm going to see again, so I think that everyone has a budget. You need to sort of prioritize what is it you're going to focus on. But one of the rules, and again there are no rules, but one of the guidelines that people say is like never go into debt for collecting. I have seen horror stories of people that have done really stupid things where like they aren't able to pay the rent, where their relationships have ended over doing wild things with the budget. But you also there's an art to this, which is like knowing when to splurge. Like a lot of people when they meet me, they see a lot of cool things that seemingly expensive things. Many of them I got years ago when they weren't expensive, but I've always tried to figure out when is the right time to splurge, and most of the time I'm actually very cheap. So pride myself on being cheap most of the time, and then pick the moment to splurge. So the guideline is like, never go into debt. But actually, if you talk to a lot of the big prominent collectors, most of us have done debt financing of stuff at times too. And so that sort of leads to my next story, which is, with all that advice, there are times when I chose to do crazy stuff. So 1994, I had the opportunity to buy a rocket-firing Boba Fett, and I was a student at the time. My income was about $1,000 US a month. That was my income, and it was offered to me for $3,000. So it was going to be like, we were going to eat ramen for like many months if I bought this thing. And so I asked Pam, I was like, I'm thinking of getting this. The rocket-firing Boba Fett is the sort of quintessential holy grail of Star Wars collecting. I really should have one. Might not be able to get one again, or if I did, it would be very expensive. And I thought she would talk me out of it. She said, "I think you should go for it." All right, And so I went ahead and did it. And it was like, it cost $3,000. Whereas now they have sold for crazy amounts of money, like $250,000 in some cases, which is actually kind of shocking because there's probably about 100, rocket-firing Boba Fett's out there. But anyway, it was an example though of a very calculated splurge. I forgot. I think I ran up my credit card on it, and then paid it back over those months. But it was like one of those things. Like, this was a calculated splurge. It's not something I would do, but I knew that that was something that I really wanted, and I had a plan to sort of pay it back, which is so. All the advice of never go into debt for collecting, a lot of collectors do make exceptions to that. So next thing I was doing, and this is where it was kind of interesting as a lot of the original generation of Star Wars collectors were a bit older than many of us. They were sort of baby boomer generation who had disposable income at the time Star Wars came out. So people that were in their like 30s, or 40s when Star Wars came out, were able to buy a lot more product than as kids. As kids, you have a much more limited budget. And so as Gen X, which was really the first generation that grew up with Star Wars, was getting back into collecting in the 90s, one of the things I found really profound was that it was also the first generation that really figured out how to network internationally, being online, being connected on the internet. And in many ways, it was a profound change in all collecting genres, but especially in Star Wars, where a lot of us were sort of like learning about collecting, coming back into interest in collecting, and then figured out, wow, through the internet, we learned so much. We connected with people worldwide. We learned about things that were scarce. We learned about where to shop for things. And so we did things, and some of us in this room, like Chris and I, were involved in like creating the first Star Wars collecting news groups. So back in the day, they had these news groups where people communicated, and they had a general Star Wars one, but we were like, we want to create one for collecting, and it was actually controversial. There were actually people that thought it was a bad idea. And then we broke it up even further as they started to make newer toys. We created a vintage group, so we wanted to keep it very focused on that. But the main message here was that it was, is to look at how you see these generational changes, and there are more since then, right? The emergence of social media and then different forms of social media, and I think part of the art of collecting is to be aware as these things change, the new technology that's available. How can you leverage that to enhance your collecting? And so we were doing that in the 90s with news groups, but later on, of course, you have the emergence of eBay and then Facebook, and all these things have played a big role. YouTube also plays a big role in collecting. And so really, as the kids that grew up with Star Wars are really the first generation to really use that and then grow as collectors. And then one of the things I got inspiration from travel in Australia. We went to Australia in 1994 and in early '94, and there I met a collecting group in Tasmania. There was a Star Wars collecting group in Tasmania, which I thought was really wild. Like, you have this city of Hobart, and they have enough people to have a Star Wars collecting group, which seems crazy. Like, wow, you have enough Star Wars collectors in this city to actually start an organization. And I thought, we need to do this back home. So really, literally the month I got home, I was like, met all these collectors I'd met at local shows. I said, let's form a group. Like all of us meet each other at these shows, and it was fascinating at the time. We would all meet at these toy shows, and everybody would go shop for their stuff. You'd say hello, you'd meet some people, but early on I suggested to people like, hey, you guys want to go to dinner after the show? And none of them had ever thought to like do anything social. They were like, I bought my stuff, I'm going home. And then we started to do that. So after I came back from Australia, I said, let's do this more formally. Let's form a group and let's just get together. We'll buy and sell stuff, we'll learn. And so we created Sarlacc, which was the first collecting group in the United States, in the Seattle area. And since then, there have been collecting groups all over the U.S. And outside the U.S. in many countries. And so that was really exciting. But that's lets you build friendships. It lets you learn about as a group, Sarlacc has done trips together and built swag together. And every collecting club and every collecting group is different. They all have different cultures, which is also another fascinating thing. They have different interests. Like Sarlacc has sort of its roots was in vintage toy collecting. Now it's very craft oriented. There are other groups that are into other things, but and then the way they govern these groups are very different, which is also fascinating. Like Sarlacc's always been sort of anarchy. It's been we were very light rules, and other groups are a bit more stricter rules. But it was fun. Anyway, it was one of the first cases of doing that worldwide, and the first case in the U.S. And then, as a lot of us were kind of coming onto the internet and the World Wide Web launched, I created the Star Wars Collectors Archive, and then with the vision of that this would be a virtual museum for all of us to pool all of our information. The original idea was we were networking with all these collectors. Why don't we just have a common place where we can just share photos and information? And so, folks like Chris helped very early on, and Chris has been a major contributor to the archive, Duncan as well, and others of you here as well over the years. The vision was it's not one person's website, it was like for the community to really put information about everything made. And then years later, when Duncan and I wrote a book on, a price guide on everything that had been made up till then, we added that whole thing to form a database as a backend for this. And so it's really online, as far as I know, the only place that really has a pretty comprehensive database of all the items ever made. And so in doing this, we're able to tap into all the niches and nuances, and we've had experts come in who know particular domains of collecting and add to it. And that's been the idea of the Star Wars Collectors Archive. But when I started it, I remember there were only like 3 Star Wars websites at the time, and they were all like really generic. They covered like fan fiction, they covered speculation about new movies, they covered photos from behind the scenes photos, that kind of stuff. And I told them I was going to do a Star Wars collecting website, and they thought I was nuts. They thought, wow, who's going to do a website on something as esoteric as Star Wars collecting? No one would ever come to the website. And of course now there's like hundreds, probably thousands of Star Wars collecting websites. And so, so that was something, though, that it was like an example of this new technology was coming along, and we said, let's go do something with it. And we wanted to do something where we could build like a virtual museum that would be better than any single collection. It would be this collective thing that really took everything from around the world. But it allows you to reflect on something that we live in really amazing times. If you look at if you've read the book Generation X, which sort of coined the term, it talks about this thing called the poverty jet set. Because Generation X was really the first generation that had affordable airfare. Like flying was a luxury up till cheap airfares really didn't start till the 90s, maybe late 80s. You start to see some examples of low cost. So you have that combined with the emergence of internet technology. So there's like 2 really profound changes in the world, and the kids who grew up with Star Wars were really the first generation to embrace those 2 things. And since then, it's like we've really lived in amazing times, right? Like we have people here who've traveled, from other cities, from other countries. You have, all of us have connected with people worldwide. This was something that other generations didn't experience, and I think a lot of times people don't reflect on, savor the amazing things in front of you that you've been handed that in the past was a really difficult thing. In the past, people had to have pen pals internationally, and that was the way they connected. So I think circa 1994 or so, as was getting far along in vintage collecting, I always had an interest in what was what were things that Kenner made, that didn't get released. I was really fascinated by that, and so I had this idea of I want to do a field trip to Cincinnati and meet people who worked at Kenner. And I remember telling Chris about this, and I remember Chris initially thought it was crazy to want to go do a trip there. Why would you want to? And then he joined me on the first trip, and we found all this great stuff, and it was like, damn, this is pretty awesome. We meet these people, we have these great stories, and it just unlocked this whole world. And so that was the first of many, many trips. But it was no other collectors were doing this at the time. And it just started a thing, and it let us learn about all the phases of the production of a toy, how toys were made. It let us learn about concepts that never made it to market. We were acquiring things for our collection. We were also getting a lot of information, hearing great stories, and over the years met hundreds of Kenner people. And so that was really exciting. And there are photos here, I guess, of the Kenner dumpster. I'll neither confirm nor deny whether I've been in that dumpster, but there was a dumpster outside the Kenner building in Cincinnati. So then, a few years later, Star Wars Celebration came around, 1999, and a couple weeks before Celebration, I reached out to Steve Sansweet. I said, well, what's happening at Celebration for collecting? What have you guys planned? I'm just curious what you're going to do. And he said, well, we're not really doing anything. There are no panels or nothing like that. I said, really? And then he said, how'd you like to just run something there? And I said, there's 2 weeks till Celebration. How am I going to put something together in 2 weeks? All right, we'll do it. Put something together. And so, having built up this network of people, I reached out to all these friends who were said, you guys want to do panels? We'll do these different topics. And it was the first time it was a complete afterthought. It was the first Celebration. We were in basically this covered area out in the open in the rain, small stage, and it was outdoors, so it was you couldn't do PowerPoint or anything like that. So people brought things to show, and it wasn't in the schedule, but so many people were waiting in line in the rain for the panels that a few people started to sort of wander to our stage and see the panels. So the first one was a bit rough because it was kind of unplanned, but since then the collecting track has been an amazing success at Celebration. It's really the only, as far as I know, the only fan-driven thing at Celebration since the beginning, and every Celebration. Many of you actually have participated, done panels at the collecting track, and it's expanded beyond just panels, right? We've auctioned off things like the Darth Vader cases, the art show we did with those. We do giveaways. Starting with Celebration 3, we started to do giveaways that were high quality and really set a very high bar, and so that when people came to our panels, they would get this incredible gift at the end of it. We have a social area at Celebration where people can come in and meet other collectors, do swag trading, do a bunch of different things, and we've done smaller panels in those rooms. We've done scavenger hunts, so it's really expanded, almost like a mini convention within Celebration. But I remember years ago when in running this and meeting with Lucasfilm folks, and they were telling me, on a con call, they were telling me you do know that the collecting track is off the charts, highest rated thing at Celebration. It was the thing that people love the most and just adore it. And I was like, oh, that's awesome. I was like, why did you have not told us this before, though? It would have been nice to know this. But we've parlayed that into well, then we can ask for more. So over the years, each Celebration, we try to push it. What else can we do? And there's a lot of goodwill from Lucasfilm and Reed about all the things we've been doing in the collecting track, because we fill the room, and it's a completely fan-driven part of Celebration. But you'll see this theme in a lot of these slides. It's about community. I believe collecting is a social hobby. There are collectors that sort of silo themselves, go find stuff, and then go home with their collection, never share the collection. And so I try to encourage people interact with other collectors, because it's going to open up a world for you. So then another thing I was into was traveling to the Star Wars locations. My first real trip to Star Wars locations was in Tunisia in 1998. And I had wanted to go to Tunisia since about 1994, but it was really, really hard to visit those locations. Nobody, the very few people, there were a handful of people, half a dozen people who had been there as fans and found the locations, but they didn't really want to share the information. They wanted to, I think they just didn't want others to know about it or whatever. So when I went to Tunisia and went to all the locations, first thing I did when I got back is gave directions and GPS to every location. So I made sure like every fan could now go there, and it just opened up. All the fans started to go right after it did that. Because like, oh my God, you can go to these places, and so I started to share that information. But it was just breathtaking. And since then, I've been to a lot of the Star Wars locations, like in here in some of the photos, like Skellig Michael they used in Force Awakens, and Finse, Norway, for Empire Strikes Back, for Hoth. But it was it was a lot of fun to go do that. But it also had like a collecting aspect to it, which was on trips to Tunisia. They had left set dressing and props behind, which is kind of shocking if people find this out. But there are places where they just buried stuff or just left stuff. I mean, there's still stuff in the area around it's Imperial Sand Dunes, but it's like near Yuma, Arizona. It's on the California side where they did the Sarlacc and the sail barge. There's still buried stuff there. I mean, they just took all the set dressing, and it's still there today. But in Tunisia, in the first trips I was doing, the Krayt Dragon skeleton was still there in the sand. Like you could, if you had the time, you could go through the sand dune area where they filmed. And on my first trip, I found some of the stuff in the sand, and I was able to get pieces of the Krayt Dragon skeleton from. They had like a local vendor that was right by the dune area, and on repeat trips would get more and more bone pieces, and it was just incredible. They left the whole skeleton back out in Tunisia, but over the years, some of it got buried in sand with sandstorms and so on. Others had been there and gotten pieces, but it was like really my first Star Wars prop came from those visits. And then so I had another time where that happened, where just stuff got left behind. So I went to Northern California where they filmed Return of the Jedi. And I went with Brandon Ellinger, who's another collector, and he and I drove down there from Seattle and found a guy who had worked on Return of the Jedi, but after the filming, he used the Endor bunker as his backyard fence. So all the panels in the bunker were his fence, and so Brandon and I bought him a new fence, and then bought the Endor bunker from him, and then drove the Endor bunker back to Seattle. But yeah, here's an old photo of us with the bunker panels I brought back. But it was just fascinating that these guys just kept all this stuff behind, and but yeah, a lot of this stuff was opportunistic. I wasn't really into collecting things from the movies, but then a crazy opportunity happened in 1999 where there were the three collectors in Missouri who had the original Death Star model. They had basically saved it. This is Todd Franklin, Pat Franklin, Tim Williams. They had saved it from basically being thrown out. And there's like a long story, I'm not going to get into the whole story today, but of how they basically saved it from destruction. But it had made its way out to Missouri, and I knew these guys for years. I knew, but I told them at one point that, if you ever decide to sell it, let me know. And then two of the three of them, Tim and Pat, wanted to sell it. I think Todd didn't want to sell it, so they outvoted Todd and they decided to sell it. And so I said, yeah, I'm interested. I didn't really collect this kind of stuff, but I decided to do a splurge and get it. And it's funny because at the time I wasn't collecting movie props much, other than the things I mentioned I found from trips and stuff. And I was kind of naive about it in a way, because it's sort of like, I was like, yeah, it'd be cool to own something like the Death Star, and then I realized later, like, there's really nothing like the Death Star. It's kind of downhill from there. There's like nothing else I'm ever going to own that's going to compare to this thing. But over the years, I did find other Star Wars items. I had a prop master from Return of the Jedi who reached out to me, and he had an ammo case and some bunker bombs that he had saved from Return of the Jedi, and the bunker, the case may not be familiar, but if you remember when Han Solo throws one at an Imperial officer and he falls over the rail, that's what he's throwing, one of these things. I don't know if the one I have is the one that Harrison Ford used in the film. But he had a couple of bunker bombs, but what was funny was when his son had the pieces, and and he lived in LA, and I said, oh, okay, well I'll fly down for the day, and we'll do the deal. We go to a Starbucks near the airport, and then I'll just fly back. So I did the deal with him, and then I realized, like, how am I going to get these back? Because I don't want to check them, because then they're going to get lost. But I can't carry on the things that look like bombs. And so I decided, you know what, I'll try carrying it on. And so went right past security. They didn't think anything of these like light up bomb looking things. So they had it in my carry-on luggage. And so I brought that home. And then I had other opportunities that came up to get Ewok masks. So I had the first one I got, which is the one on the left, was one that I got from an actor who played one of the Ewoks. He had, at this point, so this is, I want to say, probably circa 2000, something like that. People could find me on the internet that I was a collector, and so this guy reached out and said, here's the mask I had when I was an Ewok in Return of the Jedi. Are you interested in it? And I said, yeah, absolutely. And so I bought the mask that he had. But then over the years, I had other opportunities to buy a mask. I had Billy D. Williams' agent said that they have the one on the right came from Billy D. Williams. It was a gift from George Lucas to Billy D. for Return of the Jedi. And I'm surprised he had an Ewok as a gift, to be honest. Like, it wasn't something like cool like Lando's cape or his helmet from Jabba's palace. But I was happy to have an Ewok mask from Billy D. Williams, which I call the Billy D. Walk. But I got a nice autograph photo from Billy D. Williams saying this was the mask that George Lucas gifted to him. And then years later, there's another crazy story. I had a guy who was a truck driver. He used to move things between the studios, the film studios in Southern California. And so he knew Lucas and he knew people working on films. And he writes me and he says, oh, I have two really cool pieces from Star Wars. One of them's a Tusken Raider mask, and I'll show you the other thing in a couple slides. But at first I was like, okay, yeah, send me photos. And I get these emails all the time, and 9 times out of 10 or 99 times out of 100, it turns out to not be the thing they think it is. And so, I was like, encouraged him to send photos, but it wasn't, I didn't have high hopes. And then he sends me photos of this Tusken Raider mask, and then I pull up like the Blu-rays. I'm like, oh my God, the screen matches the Tusken on screen. And this guy's telling the real deal. And he lived in Indiana at the time. He was now in Indiana. So I had to I figured out how can I called him immediately, and I was like, yeah, can you meet this weekend? I'll fly out to Indiana, and I did, and just made sure to get this. But the cool thing in the Tusken Raiders is that they made 4 masks for the first film. 2 of them are in George Lucas's archives. One of them is this one that I have, and another collector has another one. But you can screen match all 4 of them because the bandage patterns are all unique on the masks, and so that's how you can tell which Tusken is yours on screen. Another crazy thing have is Palpatine's couch from The Phantom Menace. This arrived during the pandemic. And it was kind of crazy. It was the thing. It's a monster. This thing, it weighs like about 5 times the weight of a normal couch, because it's not meant to be furniture. It's meant to be like set dressing. So it's like huge solid blocks of wood. It's not very comfortable, which is what you'd sort of expect from like Sith furniture that would be very comfortable. But it's been a fun thing. That's sort of a photo op now when people come to our house, because it can sit on Palpatine's couch. There's scenes in The Phantom Menace where Padme is sitting on the couch in Palpatine's office, and my niece is like a huge, Padme is her favorite character, and so when I told her that I have Palpatine's couch, and look, here are the photos of Natalie Portman sitting on it in Phantom Menace, and she goes, I need to come over so I can put my butt where Queen Amidala sat down. That was like her fascination. So that guy who had the Tusken Raider mask, he had this other piece, which was Luke's belt. And his story was when he was at the archives, and so what happened, with the Death Star and with the other things, eventually the studio was paying for storage of everything in Star Wars, and the Death Star was saved, but a lot of the stuff basically got thrown away. And but this guy, before everything got thrown away in their archives, he was there when Lucas was there, and he asked Lucas for one of the Tusken Raider masks, and George went to grab one to give to him, and he goes, here, also take Luke's belt. So he gives him these two things, and that's what he had. But this was also an easy one to screen match. It was actually the most amazing screen match I've ever seen, because every single shot of Luke in that costume, he's wearing this belt. I don't think they had any other belt. In fact, if you look at photos, when Star Wars became very successful, they then brought Mark Hamill back and did publicity photos. They don't have the original belt anymore. They have a different belt that they're using because the original got given away. And I've talked to like replica prop makers who've tried to reverse engineer all the components that they did to make these belts. Like the tall piece is like an incredibly rare World War I era thing that I think there's like a dozen of them known in the world, and one of them is on the original Luke belt. So they're trying to trace those things down. They're exceptionally rare, but anyway, it was a pretty amazing piece that that this guy had, and I just love it. And it's so sort of iconic of Mark Hamill's costume. Another thing, and all of these had different sort of, some of them obviously landed in my lap, like Luke's belt and the Tusken Raider mask. But although I would argue that the sort of message there is for collectors is to put yourself out there. There are some I've met some collectors who love to suck information. They want to hear information, but they don't want to give back to the community. They sort of this competitive kind of thing. And I've had collectors come up to me and say, "Why are you so open about information? Why do you share all this stuff? You're giving away secrets and you're giving away information." And I said, the way I look at it is, on the balance, I've done okay. It's actually worked out well, because when people know what you're doing, what you're interested in, what you're after, that creates opportunities. And so, things like the Tusken and Luke belt, okay, they come around, there's a lot of luck and something like that, but part of it was being out there so that people knew how to reach me. But this, another piece came up. This was an example of where like knowledge and research pays off. This was a rehearsal puppet of Yoda from Empire Strikes Back. It looks like sort of a Muppet. It's in a bunch of behind-the-scenes photos of Empire Strikes Back. It went up for auction, and I bought things at auction. I don't prefer to buy things at auction. It's usually too expensive to buy at auction, and provenance is tougher with auctions. But what was funny when this came up for auction is a lot of collectors weren't bidding on it because they didn't know what it was. They said, "Oh, this looks weird. It's not screen used." But they didn't realize it's in tons of behind-the-scenes photos. It's really well documented. So it ended up working out quite well. There wasn't a lot of competition for it, but you see it in these behind-the-scenes photos. This is another fun one. This I got from a collector who got it from a guy who worked on Empire Strikes Back. This is Luke's X-Wing ladder. He had it in his garage. He was using it as a ladder after the production. He saved it. so we have this mounted on the wall in the living room. So we get people that come over, "Why do you have a ladder on your wall in the living room?" And then I say, "Well, you've got to look at that photo there of Luke on Dagobah. It screen matches that." And they're like, "Oh, wow, that's really cool." Anyway, it was another story of somebody just saving some relic from the film. Another piece that I got was, this is Ralph McQuarrie's matte painting from the first film. So McQuarrie not only did the concept art for Star Wars, he did a lot of the production art, and this is from the Death Star trench when they fly in, and it's a really cleverly done how ILM did this. You see the matte painting in the wide-angle shot, and just as it zooms into the trench, they do like a laser bolt flash for a frame, and then they cut to the model. It's sort of just such a famous shot, and used a couple times in that movie. Another cool piece. This set here, which consists of the armature, the jacket, a bunch of the accessories, and the molds for Han Hoth from the miniature they used to ride the Tauntaun. These all originated from Phil Tippett, but 3 different ways. 2 different auction houses. So I got one at one auction house. I first got the jacket, and the Hoth jacket, and some of the accessories. And it's funny, the debate about, is it a brown jacket, is it a blue jacket? And Kathleen Kennedy recently answered that and said, because the costume jacket Harrison Ford wore is brown, not blue. But the answer is, it actually depends, because the miniature is blue and the jacket is brown. So the answer, it's actually both. It's actually both colors. But the official color is brown, but actually the miniature, it's a blue. It's a mostly blue jacket. But then the armature came up in a different auction, And then years later, a friend of mine was visiting Phil Tippett's studios and saw the molds on the shelf. And he messaged me, and this is like getting word out about what you collect and what you do. His friend said, "Do you want me to ask Phil if he wants to sell the molds?" I said, "Yeah, please tell him, you know." And he said, "Yeah, Phil's interested in selling it." And then we worked out a deal, and then I got the molds as well. So that was kind of fun. And Phil had sold other things like this AT-AT miniature that was used. This is a smaller model that they used to get forced perspective. So they made AT-AT models in different sizes to really get the depth there. And I'm showing all these Hoth things. There's actually a reason, but I'm leading up to. So this is a snowspeeder pilot helmet. It's also an X-wing pilot helmet. So the helmets, the Rebel helmets, were actually, many of them were used in all three original trilogy films. So all the snowspeeder pilot helmets were refurbished X-wing and Y-wing pilot helmets. What they did is they changed the lenses and then they added padding on the inside. This one is screen matched to a snowspeeder pilot in Empire Strikes Back, but it was also used in A New Hope because all those helmets were used there, and it's also screen matched to behind-the-scenes photos from Return of the Jedi for one of the pilots there. So this is another really cool piece that spans the original trilogy. Another item is Hoth-related item is this Rebel soldier outfit, and this one has a fun story. This is again about how collectors network. So I had a few pieces like the goggles and the gloves of this outfit, and I had a rifle, one of the original rifles, and then a friend of mine had found boots, and then another friend contacted the actor who played the Rebel soldier that's on the Kenner action figure card, and bought his costume, and so between the three of us, as another guy picked up more stuff from it, we traded things to them. So I had actually let go of a number of these things, the gloves and the goggles, and I had the boots. I got the boots from one guy, traded to another guy, and then this friend at one point who had assembled a lot of the costume. At this point, he had the jacket from I think his name was Carl Bang or something like that. Is the guy's name, the actor who played the guy on the Kenner card, and he had most of the costume, and he sold me then his whole costume, and I had gotten since then the macro binoculars and then the pistol. So then I got the whole costume together. But it was an example of in collecting, it's okay to let go of stuff once in a while. I mean, these were great pieces, but it sort of fit better in somebody's collection. So I let go of some of these things, and then his friend put together a very nice set, but then he was sort of looking to buy something else, so I bought that from him and I added more stuff to it. So it's like the networking and the having friends that are willing to sort of help each other out played a big role in this. And then one of the things that all of us are challenged with, how do you display this stuff, right? And different collectors do it different ways. Some like to have it on shelves, and so I do a lot of different things. I have some custom displays. I use a museum framing shop for a lot of the 2D stuff. But I also use IKEA Billy cases. Those are sort of ubiquitous in Star Wars collecting. A lot of us have Billy cases are great for displaying stuff. But every collector has a different style. But the challenge is challenge with having this stuff. And I think a lot of my stuff's reasonably well displayed. But the only way people can enjoy it is to come to our home. And we've had over the years probably a couple thousand people visit, and we've had quite a few people, but it doesn't really get access to the public. And so years ago I started to loan things to museums, and so the Mopop Museum in Seattle, I've been loaning them things for over 20 years. They currently have a Hoth display, so some of the items I talked about you can see in this photo. This is from the Mopop Museum. You got the Rebel soldier, and you got the snowspeeder pilot helmet, you got the Han Hoth miniature is there. And so I've had things on loan to them, and then things that they come back, and then I loan them something else. They had the Death Star was on display there for 5 years. So it's really exciting because I think few collectors have had this opportunity, right, to get your stuff out into the public. But it's a fun. It's really fun when you do this because like you go to a museum and you're seeing how people interact with your piece is actually a fascinating thing. Like when the Death Star was at the Mopop Museum, I would see they had set it up with a button to hit a light that would light up, because the Death Star model has thousands of little pinholes on the surface, and that gives, that's how you get the illuminated Death Star in the film. And so Mopop had wired it up to do that, and so you see the kids would hit the button and stuff. And I sort of walked by, thinking, like, it's so surreal to see, somebody interacting with your stuff in a museum. And so that was a lot of the impetus for doing the Saga Museum, which we talked about earlier today. It's like, all of us can lend things to museums, but what if we get to shape it and set a vision for a museum and do it the way we would want to do it, and have it be a museum dedicated to Star Wars memorabilia? As we covered earlier, but just repeat for all of you, it really brings together some of the world's largest and some of the most prominent collections, but again, not limited to our collections, it will go beyond that. But really have a museum that lets us do the full range of things that you want to do as a museum, that that we're thinking big about. Lots of archive space, educational programs, workshops, guest speakers, book signings, a restaurant, but also private events. That's a huge thing. A lot of revenue from museums is actually from private events, so that you have regular museum operating hours, but in the evenings, like local companies or people having a wedding reception or whatever can rent out the museum to do big events there, which is part of our vision. So in sort of wrapping up some of the things, here were some of the themes of, sort of in my experience, in my journey. Again, this isn't gospel, as again, there are no rules. They're just sort of like, and I'm sure a lot of you would have different lessons and things you would take away from collecting. But I did talk about this a lot, but I think, I mentioned it earlier in the earlier panel about questions. Like, I'm a firm believer of pruning collections, actually keeping it fresh and novel. Some collectors get burnt out because they've been collecting the same thing and it's pretty static. But I've always kind of reinvented. I'm trying to push the limits of, like, what is a new thing I can do? What has nobody ever done? And but it's okay to actually get rid of stuff. Like, I let go of things. I used to collect, for example, replica props. And I think replica props are fine. They're amazing. They look great. But as I started to collect original props, it got kind of weird because it got confusing to people. Like, I got the replica. I have to point out, this is a replica. This is original. So I got rid of all my replica props because there are people that do that better, and that wasn't a strength in my collection. So I just it also freed up a lot of space, and so I'm a firm believer in continuing to refocus your collection and refine your tastes. I talked about splurging. I think there's an art to that. Like, when is the right time to splurge? No one has a crystal ball and knows what's going to happen in the future, but I'm not doing it as an investment. I'm going for what I like, and so there are times when it was smart to splurge. A lot of this it's a social hobby. It's really important to network. I mean, this is one of the things a lot of us have a lesson we try to teach people when they come to Celebration. There are people that come to Celebration and they just go to panels and they go home and they never talk to another Star Wars fan, and then you hear stories of them the first time they interacted with another Star Wars fan, and it's a game changer. Their whole world has changed. They have access to so much after that. They learn about so much. So I always encourage people, like, especially a lot of fans are shy. It takes some courage to go up and just talk to other collectors, and so. But I encourage them to do that because it's a game changer. And if there's one theme in my Star Wars collecting, it's always been about networking, right? It's always been like, whether it was the news groups or the archive or local groups or Celebration. It's always about how do I connect with other people. It's such a profound thing. And part of that, the last point being pass on what you have learned. Like, as collectors, I think a lot of us are like happy when we've, acquired things for ourselves, but I'm a big fan of like helping other collectors along, trying to, we were all beginners at one time, right? So like, how do you help the others? As I mentioned, it's okay to prune your collection. It's okay, like, there are times where I wasn't active in some category in my collection, but then I got back into it. But another thing, I'm sure some of you have heard this before. If you have really nice collections, you have people that come over and they're like, "How do you find all this stuff?" And there's an aspect of this which is if you've been doing it for years, you're going to get a lot of opportunities over a long period of time. Like every collector I know who's been doing it for years has amazing stuff. A lot of it's just a matter of time. And then sort of the final sort of points is, we have powerful friends, right? Like again, the friendships and the connections are really what enhances, enhances the hobby. And there's lots of ways people network, and social media though is profoundly changed that as the way that people stay connected. It's so vast now in Star Wars collecting that there are so many groups that none of us even comprehensively know all the different ways that people connect in collecting. So with that was my journey. Thank you so much for attending my panel.
Thanks a lot, guys. We started this one a little early, a little late, so we can maybe do one question if anybody has a question. Yeah, there we go. We'll do one question, and then you can always ask us something in the room later. So it's kind of a two-parter. So you keep the collection in your house.
Yes.
How do you go about ensuring all of that?
Yeah.
And are you at will to tell us how much you paid for the Death Star?
Well, that's another one. I'm not at will to. I made a promise when we did the deal to not ever share that. But I will say this: that prop collecting is very different today than it was in 1999. So it's probably worth a hell of a lot more than what I paid. But since it's not for sale, no one's ever going to realize that because it's going to go to the Saga Museum. But insurance is a great question and a frequent topic. There are companies that do insure collectibles. There's a company, Collect Insure, that probably some of you may have insurance with them that focus on collectibles insurance. And a lot of regular insurance companies do not have adequate coverage of collectibles. They think like, oh, you had this toy action figure Luke from like 1978. Well, that got stolen or damaged or whatever. We'll give you $20 to buy a new action figure on the shelf at a toy store. They don't understand the collectible value of it. So you need a policy that really covers collectibles, where they replace the older or valuable item you have. So I have a policy for my collection. Now, with that said, it gives me some peace of mind that all the money I've poured into this over the years, get some of it back if something awful were to happen. The thing is, a lot of this stuff is impossible to replace. Like, no amount of money would find, like, if the Death Star's gone, the Death Star's gone. Like, I encourage people to do get collectibles insurance. I think it gives you some peace of mind. But, I think it's also important to spend time on thinking about, mitigating the risks, right? Like, I have, like, alarm systems, cameras, multiple ones of both of those. I installed super tight security doors that even with like a battering ram you couldn't get through into our house. I have everything. I have like basement windows that are that have these bars that can get removed in an emergency, but they prevent someone going into your basement. So I'm always thinking about security, but also like fire hazards and natural disaster hazards. Nobody can guarantee that an awful thing won't happen, but you try to like reduce the risk. So I think that's also important in addition to getting insurance. But there are companies that specialize in insurance policies for collectors. I encourage people to do that, especially if you've invested so much money in it over the years. You wanna do that.
Oh, that's good advice. All right, so thanks a lot, Gus. Learned a lot there, and we'll be back in about 20-25 minutes then probably. And next up, we'll be chatting with Paul Lee about his journey from Star Wars fan to being a Star Wars action figure and what happened in between. Thanks a lot, guys.